a Babylonian priest for um, the god Ishtar. And if I remember correctly, and again, I'm speaking out of school here a little bit because I can't remember all of the issues regarding this deity Ishtar. But I remember correctly, Ishtar which is where we get the word Easter. Ishtar was a goddess of like the river. And he said, I opened this book and I was reading about this, and they showed a picture of a priest for Ishtar. And Ishtar, this priest, had a mitre on his head. It looked like the one a bishop wears or like the Pope wears, except it had fish eyes on it, out of worship for this goddess of the lakes and the rivers and the streams. And then he said he had a mitre in his hand. And of course, you've seen, like the bishops will sprinkle holy water out of those. And he said he also then had the vestments that went over and down the front and then down the back, except he said it looked just like a Roman Catholic bishop, but he said this had fish scales on it. This is the way, it was made to look like fish scales. And I thought maybe he was just a little bit over the top, but he said, I saw that picture and he says, I know the Pope is the Antichrist. Well, I'm not going to go that far. But I do think it's an interesting parallel, because we do the church did it, for example, December 25th. December 25th was a Roman holiday. And the church then, Jesus was not born on December 25th. I mean, there's maybe a 1 chance in 365 that he was. But he probably wasn't. But they used that holiday because that was a big Roman pagan holiday, and they used that date in order to incorporate that into the Christian calendar. And they were kind of trying to Christianize the pagan society in which they lived. But anyway, it's interesting that it says an Asherah pole here. I took too long to get off on all that. But it is interesting how at times we will unwittingly, and sometimes I think harmlessly, we will embrace things that really don't have any consequence. For example, Wednesday. What is Wednesday in ancient Norse? Woden's Day. Who's Woden? Well, the Germans called Odin Woden. The Norse called him Odin. The Germans called him Woden. Woden's Day, Wednesday, is the day that was set aside to worship Woden. What's Thursday? Come on, all you people that watch Marvel comic movies. Thor's Day, right? So are we pagans because we use the same terminology? Well, of course not. I just think you have to be very, very careful. And these have been battles have been fought too for centuries. I mean, the reformers went through these kinds of battles. How far should we go? Is it okay to do this? Is it okay to have this? Is it okay to have these stained glass windows? Is it okay to have, this artwork? And sometimes they were some of them were very iconoclastic and wanted to smash everything. John Calvin said that's a bad move. You don't want to just smash everything. We'll take it down, we'll store it, and keep it out of sight. But if you just start smashing everything, you're just going to create resentment. And of course, a lot of that happened. They showed themselves so iconoclastic that they ended up turning off a lot of people that might have been otherwise at least interested in their movement. So anyway, we have to be very, very careful. So the Israel fell, the northern kingdom. They're taken over by Assyria in 722 BC, which is mentioned here really in a relatively short section. We are told in the 9th year of Hoshea, this is verse 6 of chapter 17. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria and carried Israel away into exile into Assyria and settled them in Halah and Habor on the river of Gozan and the cities of the Medes. So 722 BC, the northern kingdom falls. And we just read starting in chapter 7. And if you wanted to read down through actually the end of the chapter, it tells the process that took place. What the Assyrians did when they conquered somebody, they would come into this conquered nation and they would take a lot of the people and they would just displace them and place them in other places throughout their empire. And then they would take other people from conquered lands and place them. So let's say we're Israelites, and it's the 722 BC. They come in and they take, let's say, 1/5 of our total population, and then they disperse us and put us all throughout their empire in pagan lands. Then they also then take a bunch of people from all these different pagan lands and bring them into Israel. What effect would that have? Both practically and spiritually. Not that spiritual things aren't practical, but in terms of like the spiritual life of Israel, and what practical political effect would that have? Everybody's culture would be mixed together. Everything would be kind of chaotic. And you would have people that perhaps were enemies living now in the same territory. Chances are they're not going to rise up. They don't speak the same language, don't have the same culture, they don't have the same background, they don't have the same gods. They're not going to join together and rise up and rebel against the conquering power. But what did it do spiritually in Israel? Let's just use that. It weakens them. It just brings in more idolatry. So in a sense, we could say, although there are, you got British Israelism. You ever hear of British Israelism? Who is that guy? Herbert W. Armstrong used to teach British Israelism. The United Kingdom, the British people are the 12 lost tribes of Israel. So they went into captivity and they're dispersed. You don't really hear about them anymore, but there are cult groups that come out and say, "Oh no, we're the real Israelites. The British are the Israelites," and whatever the case might be. But they were still, to a degree, in existence in Jesus's day. Who can tell me what John chapter 4 is about? And Jesus was passing through and got thirsty and sat down at Jacob's well. Where was he passing through? Who remembers? Samaria. And the Samaritans were this mixture of racial, ethnic, religious people that still existed. And they had a mixture of course, obviously Jewish worship, but also pagan worship. And if you remember back in John chapter 10, they had their own temple and everything. And remember, the woman at the well says, our people say that God is supposed to be worshipped here in Mount Gerizim. You say over here it's supposed to be in Mount Zion. Who's right? Jesus says the day is coming, which doesn't matter. What matters is you worship God in spirit and in truth. So you still had these people in existence even in Jesus's day. It was just kind of a mixture of different ethnic and religious groups. But now they kind of identified with Old Testament Israel, but they had also brought in all this extra pagan worship as well. So anyway, they're destroyed. They go into captivity. Judah is alone from Hezekiah to Ammon. And Hezekiah is an interesting figure. Let's go to 2 Kings chapter 18. Hezekiah reigns over Judah. And Hezekiah is the one who is, now that the northern kingdom is gone, the southern kingdom is alone, and Assyria now sets their sights on the southern kingdom. Assyria was a huge empire, and they were particularly brutal as well. The Assyrians had a threshing machine that they just threw people into the threshing machine and chopped them up. And they would conquer a city, they would cut people's heads off, and then they would stack the heads on the outside of the gates of the city and says, "This is what happens to people we don't like, or the people who rebel against us, or against people who don't surrender." So they were particularly bloodthirsty. At any rate, they now set their sights on Judah. And Sennacherib is the king of Assyria, and he sends some messengers. And you can read all about this in chapters 18 and 19, and I think all the way through chapter 21. Chapter 20. up to chapter 20. And anyway, you've got all these soldiers out there. They're besieging the city of Jerusalem. They've already taken some of the outposts and some of the strong points and the strongholds, and now they're threatening Jerusalem. So they come to the gates of the city and they start saying, "You better surrender because we're going to defeat you." And this Rabshakeh guy tells them, you need to surrender. He's like the field marshal, we might say, I guess, of Sennacherib's army, or at least he's part of the entourage that the conquering people sent to the city of Jerusalem. Well, anyway, they come and they say, "We're going to wipe you out. No God can rescue you. No other nation's God could rescue them. So you're not going to be able to rescue. He's not going to be able to rescue you," and so forth. So anyway, they end up going to Isaiah. So where does the prophet Isaiah? Remember, I told you about the foundational book. 2 Kings is a foundational book. So where does the prophet Isaiah historically fit? Well, he fits into the period of 2 Kings. So you go to Isaiah. Isaiah encourages Hezekiah and says, "Hang in there. God's going to rescue you. God's going to save you." Hezekiah remains firm. And I want you to note what happens starting in verse 32. Judy, would you like to look at it's chapter 19, verse 32. And then Amy, would just read down to about verse 33. And then Amy, would you read verses 34 to 37? Judy, if you do 32 to 34.
Therefore, this is what the Lord says concerning the king of Assyria. He will not enter this city or shoot an arrow here. He will not come before it with shield or build a siege ramp against it. By the way that he came, he will return. He will not enter this city, declares the Lord.
And it came to pass that night that the angel of the Lord went out and smote in the camp of the Assyrians 180,500. When they arose early in the morning, behold, they were all dead corpses. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and went and returned and dwelt at Nineveh. And it came to pass, as he was worshiping in the house of Nisroch, his god, that Adramelech and Sharezer, his sons, smote him with the sword, and they escaped into the land of Armenia. And Esarhaddon, his son, reigned instead.
Yeah. So in other words, Isaiah says, God will put the wood to these people. Don't worry, Hezekiah. So Hezekiah rests in the Lord. 185,000 soldiers died in one night. Now, how they died, I mean, obviously it was a miracle. We always conjecture, was there some sort of a natural thing that took place here? Remember we talked about how the Philistines got the tumors. So they sent back little gold tumors and little gold mice in the Ark of the Covenant as a sacrifice, which shows that's a hint that perhaps the plague that hit the Philistines was the bubonic plague or some form of plague, which comes from rodents and the fleas that infest rodents. Whether, who knows what happened here, 185,000 died. It could just be that God said, that's it. It could be that it was some sort of a natural plague, who knows, anthrax, whatever, which will kill a person very quickly. We don't know. But anyway, God defends the city. And look what he says. Verse 34, "I will defend this city to save it for my own sake and for my servant David's sake. I am going to preserve the kingdom and keep my promise." And God always keeps his promises. Now, just very quickly, I want to take a look. You know what? I didn't make it. Let's leave that. And I want to talk about Manasseh. Manasseh is important. And so is Josiah. And I don't want to just brush over that, fly over it in 2 minutes. Both of those are important individuals. And because they are reverse images of one another. And Manasseh is the one who God says, I don't care what happens now. He was so wicked, judgment is coming. I'm not going to spare the southern kingdom. And then Josiah, despite the fact that the kingdom is going to be destroyed and he knows it, he's still godly and God blesses him for his godliness. So let's stop right there and we'll talk about what takes place under Manasseh and Josiah on the 8th. Okay. Any questions or comments over anything? All right. Take time to fellowship a little bit and we'll have worship service in just a few moments.